Yo, this hot, this the spot, there it is pod.com. We're interviewing the best comedians, so tune in quick and get your ears receiving them. We talking about life and life to stream right to you, from the microphone right to your home, dude. Side note, this might get embarrassing, but no, don't sweat, yo, cause there it is.
Welcome to the There It Is podcast, a comedy podcast to help you find your inspiration. I'm your host, Jason Barr. Let's do this. Thanks so much for joining us. Great episode we have today. I had a really fun chat with comedian, circus performer, and data scientist, Andrea Jones-Rooy. It's a very fun chat. They are so cool, and I learned a lot listening to them. And if this is your first time with us, check out enhanced episodes from the last year on our YouTube, youtube.com/thereitis. All episodes are going up there, but the ones from the last year or so have been enhanced by a brother of the show, and those will go out later in the week, like this one goes out later in the week. But if you would rather listen to episodes while you are on your commute, you can listen to every episode of the podcast wherever you get podcasts. Well, let's get on to today's episode. We have a really thrilling chat here, and I learned a lot. It's also a lot of fun. Here's my chat with Andrea Jones-Rooy. I really loved Big Magic. It was really inspirational, and one of the things that I hadn't heard anyone else describe the way she did, but I completely agreed, was about when you get an idea, when the muse strikes you, you do have to just get to it. You have to, because otherwise it goes away. And she had this amazing story about an idea she had. It was a very specific book idea, and she kind of hemmed and hawed on it and didn't get around to writing it. And then a friend one day, another writer, said, "Oh, I've got an idea for a new book." And the person went on to describe the exact story. And it was sort of like, oh wow, big magic. It's real.
Yeah, it's like the idea is out there. You just have to grab it, basically.
Right.
Interesting.
Super interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Gosh. All right. Well, I'm like on my high horse from having written today. It's like, oh, I got to write tomorrow and the next day. Like anytime something occurs to me, not just like once in a while. Yeah. No, I've done that. Or like you're falling asleep and you're like, oh, I'll remember this in the morning. And it's like, nah.
Oh, you never do.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I never remember when I think of something when I lay my head down. Yeah. Sometimes you got to choose sleep.
Yeah, that's also fair. Yeah. Yeah. Or you write something down and then I've done this too. And then the next morning you're like, what does that mean? I don't know. Like,
oh, yeah. If it's the middle of the night.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I have a lot of respect for people who will burn the midnight oil, but I've recently realized that you could probably see I'm a big Prince fan. And, that's what he did. He barely slept and he would stay up all night. That lifestyle is part of what killed him. So maybe I don't need to emulate it.
That's an interesting point. Yes.
And same with Michael Jackson.
Wow.
So
I hadn't put it together that way. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when I hear like Donald Glover is doing stuff like that, where he's just like up and barely sleeps, I'm like, well, better to probably just take care of yourself first.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know about Donald Glover, but I imagine that, if you're going to go that long without sleeping, you're obviously, well, not obviously, but involved in various substances. And I know that was a part of the story with Michael Jackson and Prince. Not the only part, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I used to play that game too. I would like grad school-ish. It was like a sign of dedication to just be up all night. And it's like, then you just feel sick for days. And I don't know.
Right.
I'm the same. I'm trying. My temptation is towards that, but I'm trying not to. So, but I'm not much of a morning person either. So it mostly just means I wake up and I'm late for the day. And then at night I'm like, well, I'm tired. So something has to give.
We have the same brain. I'm a night owl by nature, and I do want to get up and get started on the day. I'm not necessarily a morning person, but I'm not someone who hates the morning. I actually enjoy certain parts of the morning. But I am dragging every morning, and it just makes me feel late for everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Or if I do want to, the various writing advice, morning pages and all of that, where it's like write for bird by bird, like write first, wake up, start writing. Like if I do that, I wake up so late that I'm just like, well, I can't meet anyone. Like you're my first meeting of the day, like, cause I can't. And then I'm like, that's not how you function in society. So yeah.
Yeah. I gotta find a rhythm that actually works. And there's talk out there of saying you don't have to stick to this rhythm that they say, this rigid system of, well, you got to start working in the morning. Like if your creative brain kicks off at night, then you can write then, that's fine.
Yeah.
But I also want to incorporate being good to myself so I can be healthy.
Right. Incorporate, staying alive. Yes.
That's ideal. That's ideal.
Yeah, not to be a real Goldilocks about this, but I'd like to not be dead. So,
well, in the 6 years I've been doing this podcast, I have had some amazing multi-hyphenates on, but you have to be the most interesting multi-hyphenate. Your multis, the range is more than any I've seen. You comedian, circus performer, data scientist. I can see a couple of those working together, but then you get thrown for a loop. You're also, of course, an author and professor and public speaker. Very cool. This is how we came to find out about you. Girlfriend of the show, Justina, and I found you because you recently did a show at Caveat about data science.
Yes.
It was a very exciting. We didn't actually get to go. We had to watch the live stream, but we couldn't be in person. But I wish we had been in person because you did so much. You started with circus performing it, like interstitially, I guess it was throughout the show. And then it's funny. And then it's also very informative because it's about data scientists. And it all was so great. But the point you were making about data science was also so intriguing to me because I hadn't heard anyone made that. You're very welcome. I hadn't heard anyone make the point you were making. Because so many people, as you were saying, will say, well, what does the data say? Well, the data says this, but you are making the point that the data doesn't speak.
Right.
Data is not a person.
Right.
We read data. People read it. You were like, I can speak.
Yeah.
Well, oh, you're not listening to me.
Yeah.
Can you unpack this a little bit of what your feeling is on data science and how it should be used?
Sure. Well, I'm so excited to talk about all of these things. So thank you for the kind words. And like any true artist, the longer it's been since you perform a thing or submit a thing or set something out in the world, the more you're like, was that a huge waste of everyone's time? It might've been. So I really appreciate your words against my own self-destroying brain. I would say that the big thing with data science is that we think of the world as data-driven. And that's the word that you see everywhere: data-driven journalism, data-driven insights, data-driven blah, 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 right? And I think we have it all backwards. We drive data. Data is just, as you said, it's just numbers that are in a spreadsheet or a table or a matrix of some kind, and we put them there. Data doesn't exist out there in the world. Like there's a distinction between data and capital T truth. And I think we conflate the two. We think, oh, what does the data say? As in, what's the true mirror of reality? When in fact, this is like way more philosophical than I intended to be. I have to say, I didn't come on here expecting to say true mirror of society or of reality, but here we are.
I love it.
Yeah. So data only exists because we've said, oh, that's a thing out there that I want to measure or know more about or observe or examine or compare. And so I'm going to write that down, whether it's the temperature or the number of people running a race or the types of skills that are on my team in the workplace, whatever, right? So I'm writing those things down, and therefore the data only exists because I have said, okay, this is worth turning into data. And then we look at those numbers and we decide what the story is that we want to tell based on those numbers. We can say, oh, wow, these numbers are super different from these other numbers. Is that interesting? Well, I'll decide. Am I going to do something about it? Well, that's for me to decide. Oh, this is going up. Should we keep doing what we're doing if we want it to keep going up? Is it going up for some other reason? Is it going up but not enough to really pay attention to? And so we turn numbers and trends and insights. You know, an insight only exists because we've looked at some numbers and said, well, that's interesting because it's somehow a departure from or a confirmation of what I think is going on in the world. Anyway, that's a long way of saying, yeah, we think data comes first and the rest of us are following, but that's like driving through the rearview mirror.
Right. It's very cyclical.
Yes.
We are the reason that it is what it is. It's sort of like when a politician uses rhetoric just to fire up the base or just to stir the pot and get some attention. And then everyone gets frothed up and riled up. And then the campaign team for that politician will say, well, everybody's saying this. I guess this is what I need to reflect. It's like, no, they got it from you.
Yeah.
Like you started that. Like it's not because that's what everyone thinks. They think it, they're just saying it because you said it.
Right.
That's why
and now
they
you're
believe
saying,
it.
well, they're saying it. So here we go.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. I also have to commend you on the word frothed up. I haven't heard that with respect to humans in politics. I was like, that's a very generous way to put a lot of people screaming and yelling and like, I'm frothed up. I don't like it. It's like a little cappuccino society.
I guess that is they're foaming at the mouth for sure.
Right. Yeah. Frothed up in like a rabies way, not like a macchiato way. Got it. No.
Right.
Yeah.
But it is so interesting because there is an importance. I mean, obviously you're not anti-data science because that's what you do.
Correct.
Because a lot of people might get on the internet who are not people who've ever studied data science, and they'll get on and poo-poo the numbers and poo-poo the data as if it just means absolutely nothing and we should ignore it. Right. But it's not that it should be ignored. It just should be framed appropriately, and we're not currently framing it appropriately.
Exactly. You continue to put, I should have had you do my show because you're putting it all much better. I feel like my version was a much more foamy, ranty kind of way, like, and another thing, whereas you're like, here's the way we should reframe it. Oh, that's a very good way to put that.
Oh,
yeah, I think
use it. Use it if you do that.
I'll use it. Yeah, great. I'm so glad we're recording this conversation. I'm just going to overlay everything you say on the recording of my show, and then be like, that doesn't line up, but all right. I agree, and I think that sometimes I worry that my coming out hard on like nothing is data driven, data does not equal capital T truth, all that stuff, I worry a lot because if you take it even a tiny bit out of context, I sound extremely anti-science, and I am, one soundbite going viral away, not to flatter myself, from being like the hero of the climate deniers and the pandemic is a hoax and the ivermectin movement and all of those other things.
Right.
But it's exactly as you said, is that I think, and this is kind of one of my theses that I'm messing around with a little bit, is that I think both sides, not to be hyper political about it, but the kind of like we believe science side and the I did my own research side of things have it wrong. And exactly, I mean, the numbers are there. The CDC data is there, for example, and to name some data that we're all arguing about all the time. It's not perfect. There's selection bias, there's measurement problems, there's definition, there's all kinds of issues with that data, right? The same thing with the data about whether the vaccines are killing us or whatever, right? But the fact that one side is saying, no, this data is perfect, this is the truth, and we need to do the following policies, is leaving the door wide open for others to say, like, actually, the data is not perfect, and they have a point, but then they say, because it's not perfect, I'm going to reject the whole thing wholesale. Whereas really both sides need to be like, these numbers aren't perfect. They're our best bet at understanding what's going on. We can think about how to make them better and how to make more thoughtful inferences. We're probably overestimating this and underestimating that, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we could both actually come to conclusions that make sense. It's like, because we're like, no, this is correct and we have to believe it, I think it's just inviting the kind of skepticism that we're seeing. So I do try to think about how to reframe it, though, because a lot of times I'm just like, the whole point of science is to be wrong. And it's like, well, I believe that, but I need to preface it somehow, be like, but it's still the best we've got, right? Maybe that's the way. Yeah.
That's a good point, because that is the thing I have heard a lot of scientists say, or a few scientists say, is this isn't truth the way we talk about truth. And it's not theory the way people use the word theory colloquially.
Right.
Like the average person says, well, a theory can just be this person's idea versus where that's not in science the way theory is used. per se,
Right.
right? So there is some confusion there with the technical use of the terms and the layperson's use of the term.
Yes.
So I get that. That's a very good point. It's all very interesting because you then start seeing like with COVID, because you mentioned COVID and how people talk about the numbers with COVID and the data with COVID. I've seen people say, well, in Florida,
Hmm.
the numbers are blah, blah, blah. And in New York, well, look at this spike. And it's like, well, Omicron. And then also there are over 8 million people in a 30 square mile area.
Right.
Like it's
Who are
an
probably
island.
indoors more. Yeah.
Right. We're on trains together. So you can't really compare that to a place way bigger like Florida.
And we're probably also getting, I don't know for sure, but we're probably also getting tested a lot more because for me,
Right.
I walk around and I cough once and I say, okay, test time, right? Whereas if you're
Right.
in Florida and you living as though the pandemic's over, you're probably not going to go say, I'm going to get a nasal swab just for fun. So I would
Right.
imagine Trump himself, now becoming super political, I'm getting frothy again. Trump himself made a point that was a very valid point. It was a horrible policy, but it was a valid scientific point, which is like, well, the numbers will go down if we stop testing so much. You're like, oh, that's true. Like, he's not wrong about that. But that doesn't mean that, there still is a capital T truth out there. People are sick and people are dying, but the
Right.
numbers are going to look different depending on how we interact with that truth, right?
Right. Yeah. His weird use of pragmatism was so strange. Like it
Yeah.
could have been so helpful
Yeah.
for someone to say, like, all right, everyone, let's not get alarmed. The numbers are what they are because we're testing so much. That would have been a much
Right.
more valid way
Right.
of phrasing it
Right.
for people to calm people, because it's like it's the public and you don't want to alarm the public, but you do want them to be cautious. And
Right.
that's why the way he did say it was sort of like, oh, you're not helping.
Right. Right. Yeah. Like
And this,
it's one of those where some comedian, not me, has some joke that's like every fifth thing Trump says is right, which makes it like, he'll be like, we should stop getting tested. The numbers will go down. LaGuardia sucks. And everyone's like, well, I do agree with that. Like, does that mean that the other crazy stuff is right? Out of context. I mean, if you go to, I don't know why I was there, but I was on the Clorox bleach website the other day. Why was I there? I didn't buy bleach. Anyway, it still has a warning that's like, do not inject this in your veins.
yeah.
Like, this is because our president, anyway, I'm sure we don't need to
We don't need to relive those
rant and
years,
rave
but-
about that. Yeah.
But it is an interesting thing because now with so many at-home tests and people aren't all connecting it to the app, they're just doing the swab, and the numbers can be thrown off that way,
Yeah.
right? Like in
Yeah.
where I'm from, South Carolina, people, just like you were mentioning in Florida, they're probably not saying, oh, I sniffled, let me go just make sure. They're not doing that as much because they don't. There's so many people in South Carolina who are deniers,
Right.
and naysayers of all of it. So they're not getting tested as much unless it's serious enough that they have to go to the hospital or something
Right.
like that. Probably, right?
Right.
But then also some of those at-home tests that people are taking here are maybe not as accurate. So the numbers are definitely not accurate. That's one of the things you kind of talked about in the show that you did,
Yeah.
was that one of the factors when it comes to data is human error
Mm-hmm.
or other kinds of error. It was a very well thought out and also funny show. And one of the things I want to talk about is, how do you take something that's like data science? I mean, it's not the
It's not
same.
fun. I mean, I think it's fun,
Yeah.
but it's not.
Right.
It's not everyone's
The
favorite
average
party
person
topic.
can get
Yeah.
into comedy about politics because
Right.
it creates such a strong emotional feeling for them. Data science, the average person doesn't have a feeling about. So
Right.
how do you still make fun comedy out of it? I thought you did a really interesting thing with it. Can you kind of talk about how you found humor and how you decided to present it the way you did to make it a
Yeah.
little jazzier and fun?
Thanks. Yeah, I wish I could say, well, there's this recipe that I follow, and every 3 minutes you have a joke or whatever, and I'm not that methodical. But I would say, a mix of my own. Well, I think the driving force of the show is that I'm frustrated because I feel very lucky to have gotten exposure to data science and quantitative methods largely by accident in my life. I enrolled in a program not really knowing that it was a science program. I thought I was going to write essays. And so it just kind of got forced into it. And since then, I feel like I look around the world and I talk to, so I teach at NYU, so undergrads in data science, and I do speaking with companies and I do consulting and things like that. And I see people getting it wrong, not like because they're dumb, but just because the way we talk about it is inaccurate, right? And so I went through this long program where I learned to be very humble and careful, and every single number is a subjective approximation of reality. And like, I feel very grateful that I got access to that information. And then I stepped out of academia and was like, whoa, we're talking about this in a very different way. And so I say all of that to say that I think humor can come from emotions of any kind. And I think if I weren't so worked up about it, it might have been harder to make it funny. You know, like you said, with politics, we have opinions, we have feelings, we have, attachments and all of that. And so I think it's part of the reason that I, am able to like rant and rave about something as mundane sounding as data science is that I actually am really mad about it and frustrated, and I see the sides talking past each other. It's not like I have some vision into reality that others don't. It's just that I feel like I did, luck out and spent 10 years learning from statisticians about how to think about numbers. And then it's just like, there's just a big disconnect between how it's talked about in the world and what's going on in the sciences or whatever. Right. On the other hand, I would say that I also am someone who's very easily bored. And I've been teaching data science for a very long time. So I taught at NYU Shanghai and Carnegie Mellon before being at NYU New York. And I taught political science, but like a very quantitative version of political science. And then when data science took off, I decided, if I want to keep having a job, I'll just call myself a data scientist. And so now I teach data science, but it's the same thing, basically. Right. And, I'm going to get fired, but that's basically what's going on. And I've just talked about it forever. I mean, I've taught for maybe 10 years and I've spoken to companies about this kind of stuff many times over the last few years. And for my own, I still think it's important, but for my own sanity, watching a show that someone is obviously enjoying doing is always more fun. And reading a book that someone hopefully enjoyed writing is more fun. And so I selfishly put it in just so that I can keep going with it, because I do think it's important. And otherwise I'll get bored out of my mind. I mean, the flip side is that I actually got a student evaluation last semester. Student evaluations are horrible things, and they're just very personal attacks. And one student told me that I put in too many jokes, and I was so upset. And I barely put any jokes in my classes, but it's like, for my own sanity, you can only talk about standard deviation so many times until you lose your mind. And so I try to liven it up a bit, but apparently they didn't like it, so I got to tone it down. Or they're just jokes. Yeah.
Yeah, those, I always tried to be kind with those. And there are probably a couple of people I should have been a little bit more honest about, but
yeah. I'm convinced they've gotten meaner over the years, but maybe I'm just getting worse. I don't know.
I would believe it when you look at the tone on the internet and how gripey everybody is, and something doesn't even have to be true for it to resonate with people. It just has to be very angry or mean-spirited. Yeah. It's a sickness that we're going through.
Well, I also have an idea that this is sort of not particularly well supported, but I have an idea that we wrongly think that in order to learn, we have to suffer. And, we have these ideas of like sitting in a lecture and it being boring and dry, and somehow that equates with greatness and genius. And so I think, and I don't know if this is, the kids these days are getting more, I mean, there is documented, increased anxiety, but maybe just more thoughtful measurement of anxiety, who knows, among younger people now, and rightly so, if that is true, because of the pandemic and all these other things. And so I can see how students who are like, well, I'm paying a fortune for this, and I don't know if I'm going to get a job. And if I don't get a job, I'm going to be in debt forever, and and all the pressure about having an internship every waking moment and all these other things. For someone like me to come in and, well, I'm not that funny in class. Once per lecture, have a joke about like a horse data set that we're using that I think is ridiculous. And I could see how that would almost be insensitive if you're like very anxious about your future. But all of that is to say is that when we think about learning, we think about relatively dry material. And so I'm, hoping to change that a tiny bit. Now, I'm not the only one doing that. Lots of people are doing like cool science comedy and stuff like that. So
yeah, and when I was in college, I had couple of teachers who had a good sense of humor or would say something funny. So if someone's complaining about it, it's
Yeah.
their personality. You
Yeah.
know, it's what are you
Yeah.
gonna do?
Yeah.
Everyone's seen the Amazon. I kind of enjoy looking at Amazon reviews because I feel
Right.
like I've gotten good at deciphering what is significant here. You know,
Right.
because they're almost all 5 or 1-star reviews.
Right.
It's
Exactly.
there's very little nuance.
Yes.
You need the nuance.
Yeah. And that's the selection bias right there, right? You only
Yeah.
bother to write a review if you're passionately in love with or desperately hate whatever
Right.
it is that you're doing. And so the same is true for teaching evaluations. It's the ones who are irritated. I gave them an A-, who are like, and another thing about your fundamental personality that I don't
Yeah.
like. You're like, oh, okay. And they're not fun like Amazon reviews because they're not public. So Amazon reviews, they sometimes try to be like funny or whatever. So they can end up on Reddit, but not these. They're just grim.
True. Yeah. They just want to hurt.
They're really mean. That's what you wanted to talk about, right? Trump and teaching evaluations.
Well, let's talk some more about what you do because when it comes to data science, because you've mentioned a lot of the jobs you've had, but you've also worked at 538, which if you're looking on Twitter, there's controversy always, every political season about it. And I'm wondering your perspective on the way people talk about the way 538 talks about data or the way people talk about the data 538 is bringing to light, because it seems like there's a lot of overlap with what you're talking about in the response to 538.
Yes. It's so funny you mentioned that because I think, it happens almost weekly at this point. But I think Nate Silver is trending currently. Or at least on my whatever algorithm results I'm being fed. But it could be because every time Nate Silver clicks on it, I read everything because I'm very interested. So I did work at 538 for about a year and a half leading up to the midterm 2018 election. So a while ago. And there are really great people there. They're doing really interesting and important work in a lot of ways. I think they do still struggle with, and they were very open about it and they've been open about it, and I didn't have an answer for them, struggle with talking about numbers in a thoughtful way. And that can take the form of where data comes from, which is sort of what I tend to focus on, is like, where do these numbers, why do we have these numbers in the first place? What do they mean? And I think 538 errs a little bit too on the side of trusting data as capital T truth. I mean, they're in journalism, and so fact checking means we have a 36 written here. Let's check with the US government records and make sure that that's a 36. Okay, it is. But my point as a scientist is like, yeah, but the real number probably isn't 36. Doesn't mean we throw it away, but it's noisy or oversampling or we're missing something or whatever. But they also really struggle, and again, to their credit, very openly, about how to communicate probability. And humans are famously bad at making sense of probability. If you say something is a 90% chance of happening, and it doesn't happen, everyone is like, well, it didn't happen, you're wrong. And you're like, well, 90% is not 100%, right? And the same if it's 10%, you're like, well, you said 10% of cancer, why do I have cancer? So they struggle with that, and I don't think that's their problem. More recently, I think they have run into some trouble that other data scientists run into as well, which is in our enthusiasm about working with data and numbers and our hubris, and I put myself in this category as well, of saying, well, I know machine learning and I know how to make predictive models and I know how linear regression and blah, 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 all these things work. I'm therefore suddenly an expert in every field that I've got data on. And I think Nate, for example, at least today and in the past, has gotten in trouble for weighing in on public health policies. And in the past, he said things like, I'm not a public health expert. I think his bio right now says I'm not a virologist. Not that I'm reading his bio every day, but I did read it today. And he says these things, but then he comes out and says, well, the mask mandate does this, or it doesn't do that, or we don't need it, or whatever. And that's a problem with data scientists generally. Something that I am guilty of for sure is that, as I said in the beginning, I trained as a political scientist. I think I have a pretty good understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of a lot of political data, including the polls that 538 uses. And there's a lot of weaknesses there, but we don't throw it away. And I don't think we should. But I don't have that kind of expertise when it comes to economic data, psychological data, certainly COVID related data. A friend of mine is dealing with cancer right now and looking through various like cancer research, various medical journals. And I even had the audacity to be like, I'll take a look and tell you what I think. Like, I shouldn't, right? Just because I know what numbers are and how to think about numbers doesn't mean I know the substantive implications of all those different fields. And I think the whole 538 and Nate Silver thing, I think they get into a lot of trouble when they step outside the sports and politics worlds where they do have a lot more knowledge. And I think also people just like hating on Nate because he can often sound like a know-it-all. And yeah, we have too many know-it-alls in the world. I'd like some more humility myself. I keep being like, I'm going to get fired, but like, I don't work there, so I'll say it. Yeah.
No, you make a very good point, because there are a lot of people, and you mentioned the sports world, there are a lot of sports journalists who will just kind of look at somebody's stats and then say, oh, well, they'll not do that. They're not going to do this. They're not going to do that. They blah, blah, blah. And that's not how playing the game works.
Right. Right. And I'm not a sports person, so I shouldn't go too far in this. But another idea I'm currently thinking about is like the whole Moneyball revolution in baseball, right? Where they're like, oh, let's just measure these various other stats and put together the world's greatest teams that there ever were. And that's cool. My understanding is that that's made baseball even more boring than it already was. I don't know if you're a baseball person, but that's like one of the big takeaways. It's like no one's getting on base anymore. But the other piece of this, for me anyway, is that whole revolution goes back to this idea of data driven. And it was someone's, Billy Beane, is that his name? The dude who thought of the whole Moneyball stats revolution in baseball as a strategy. That's an idea that led all of that. And then he decided to look at all of those numbers and assemble teams in that way. It wasn't the case that all of a sudden these numbers appeared and said, get people who are going to get on base, right? It was an idea. And so again, I think we lose sight of the fact that it's ideas that drive all of these things, and data is just a tool. Exactly. And 538 could stand to have a few more ideas that they then test, as opposed to like stare at some numbers and say like, yeah, take the masks off the planes. You're like, you're being a little cavalier about that.
Right. Because I think what some people say, and they'll also say like, well, the CDC said, so I don't need to wear masks. But the thing is, they're not considering what might happen if we all just stop wearing masks,
right? And
how that will change the data.
Right. And understandably, it would make sense that you would hit this kind of churning equilibrium where it's like, we all take our masks off because the numbers look good, whatever we decide that is. And then indeed the numbers creep up. So we put our masks back on, and then we go down and we go up, and mix in vaccines and seasonal behavioral pattern changes and all this other stuff. And again, I think it goes back to our messaging around science, where we treat it as this like static holy grail of correctness, when really it's us doing the best we can with the information we have right now, and needing to be humble and knowing that that's going to change. And exactly as you said, I think in general, we're very bad in science, and frankly, everywhere, at understanding this endogeneity, which is like the circular causality, which is if I take my masks off, that's going to change the numbers, which might affect what we have to do with our masks. And we're just not good at communicating that. We're not good at thinking about that. I'm bad at that in my own life, right? I'm like, well, I'm not wearing masks anymore, and I just don't, no matter what. But that doesn't make sense, right?
Right. It just depends on so many factors, and and now at this point it's so confusing, people don't know what to do.
Right.
It's sort of like, well, I guess I'll wear a mask, and then you go in and it's just like two other people there, so you go, I guess I'll take off the mask. I don't know. Like, I feel silly wearing it now. It's just so I just hate COVID, and I want it to go away.
Same. No, it's totally become so much more a social signal and a political signal than, at least for me, which is a big departure from a lot of social scientific models where we all make individually optimizing, hopefully, decisions, right? It's actually about what other people around me are doing. And if I walk into a room and everyone else is wearing a mask, I'll wear a mask, right? This is setting aside, various rules around there. But I'm from Maryland originally, and I went there, when was I last there? Over like kind of New Year's time. And in New York, we were still masking all the time. And in Maryland, and I'm from Western Maryland, which is like basically West Virginia. So as you might imagine, we all burned our masks down there. We actually never had any, right? It's like not something that's going on.
To burn them, yeah.
Right, exactly. Just to keep New York and those other coastal elites from having them.
Yeah,
and so I would go into I would go into a store wearing a mask out of habit. And then I'd be walking around and realize no one else was wearing a mask. And I was like, well, if no one else is wearing a mask, that's an even bigger reason to wear a mask. And I live with I was visiting my older parents, all that stuff. But then I was like, no, they're going to think that I'm some liberal Biden loving whatever. And I'm going to get, beaten up, or people are going to yell at me. So I should take it off. And so it ended up becoming this whole, what do I want other people to think of me, as opposed to what do I think the public health story is about?
Yeah. And that, I think a lot of people are feeling that, and it's very difficult. And so much of it is a response to the situation. It's and not the situation health-wise, but the situation socially. I don't want to be seen as afraid of it.
Right.
And I mean, that was one of the big things with Joe Rogan, right? He freaked out at first, like everyone else, was wearing a mask everywhere. And then he didn't like feeling freaked out. So he said, I'm not going to wear a mask, and I'm not going to be afraid of it. But then when he gets it, he throws a kitchen sink at it because he was still afraid.
Right.
And not being honest with himself. And if we could all just be honest with ourselves and say, here's where we're at right now, and this is how airborne diseases work.
Right.
So I guess a mask makes the most sense until it goes away. Then I think we'd be in a better place. But
well, and I think that this is not an innovative or thoughtful point at all, but I think the fact that we're in a world, and maybe we always have been ever since mass media existed, but we're in a world where we all have about one or two sentences to say our piece is not exactly conducive to what you just, all being as thoughtful as you just described, where you say, well, here are the trade-offs, and here's what I know, and here's what I don't know. And so here's what that can't fit in a tweet. That can't fit on TikTok. And if you try, no one's going to watch it. Having tried.
Oh, yeah. No one likes the nuance. And if you say one thing that's just to set up or frame what you're about to say, then someone's already jumping in and saying, well, what about this? And da 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 da. And it's no, I'm not saying that because I haven't even finished my thought. Just give me more than 2 seconds to speak, please. That's all really interesting, because people wouldn't think that any of that would have to do with data science, but it has so much to do with data science.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like a problem of politics, but it's a problem of literally every piece of information. I mean, look at the debates a lot of them become politicized, but the numbers around climate change, we're not looking at different numbers. I mean, we might be prioritizing different data sets or different studies, but the numbers are there. And we're telling very different stories about them and coming to different conclusions about them.
Right.
And one of the points I make in the show, and that I make all the time when I talk to everyone I can, including I'll make right here, is that data science is about, yes, it's about statistics, yes, it's about programming, but it's also about expertise in the subject area that you're talking about. And that's the piece where I think 538 sometimes steps out of its area. And I think all of us are trying to make sense of climate and COVID data, and we don't have the skills to make sense. I don't have the skills to make sense of those things. And never mind the fact that stats and programming are already super hard. And by the way, that idea comes from someone named Drew Conway, this that Venn diagram where it was we need programming and we need stats and we need expertise. And the folks with expertise, if they're not trained in programming or stats, often think they have nothing to say on the data side of things. But I would love to have, more, again, public health or climate experts who maybe, or even people who understand interventions in local communities to change behavior. I would love to see them weigh in on climate change, but instead we see a lot of well, if you haven't been a data engineer your whole life, then we don't want to hear what you have to say, right? And so it's no, we have to think. That's basically the whole point. It's we forgot that data science involves thinking, I think is what it all boils down to.
Right. It's not just looking at the numbers and then the person who understands how the numbers are put together making all the decisions.
Right.
It's everyone sort of saying, okay, well, that makes me think blah, 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 blah. It's things that's, going back to COVID, not to over talk about that, but that's one of those situations where you kind of have to do that based on where you are. In South Carolina, it didn't spread as quickly as immediately as it did in New York because it's a state that has 3 million people less than are in New York City. And it's about 10 times larger than New York City. So people were spread out more. It couldn't spread as fast. So
Right.
there does need to be a different approach. But what happens is the people who were not naysaying COVID just start mocking the people who were just not there yet
Yeah.
and just didn't understand it on this in the same level because they couldn't see it on the same level.
Yeah.
And because it was happening differently. Oh gosh, we're all putting ourselves in such a bad place by behavior, not
Right.
by the data,
Right.
not because of whatever. It's the behavior that's the problem.
Right. Well, and it's the basic interpretation. I'm going to get the specific numbers wrong, but my understanding is, we would say in case it's not obvious, I identify on the left side of the political spectrum. It's going to come as a shock to you and your listeners, but we would say, oh, it's, COVID is the most infectious airborne disease compared to all these other things. It's so much worse than the flu. It's so much worse than this, all these things. And then on the right, we would see the various protests and I'd see the signs that were like 97% survival rate. Why are we shutting down 100% of the economy, which is a pretty good slogan. But both numbers are right? But it's the stories that we're telling around those numbers and what we think the ways of dealing with it, or whether the extent to which we should deal with it and the trade-offs that we're making to deal with those numbers. That's a human, philosophical, political, ethical, sociological discussion. And that, again, is where I'm just like, the data science, we forget, again, that humans collect data and science is how we make sense of that data. And there's no magic to it. It's just us thinking really hard about ways that we've approximated the world. And then we see people end up in these different camps. A friend of mine, Andrew Heaton, has a podcast called The Political Orphanage, where he tries to take away the partisanship side of things. And he basically says it's tribalism, right? We don't even care about what the actual reality is. We're just saying, well, my team says this and we're louder than your team. And that's where it ends, which is not how you make sense of data. Never mind.
No, it's also not good for figuring out how to accomplish anything.
Right.
I just wish people would step back and say, hey, we've been doing that for decades and it hasn't worked.
Right.
So can we stop? Can we stop doing that?
Yeah. Well, and again, this isn't, even remotely limited to make arguments about data. I mean, it's about everything. It's like, if you try to understand where the other side is coming from, which I'm not a psychologist, but a friend of mine who is once told me that the best way to come to an agreement between two people, one way that he recommends his patients, is to say, I understand why this point of view is so important to you. And then you have to say, I understand why this, right? We go through this thing. But if I say that about a political view that my friends and I don't have, I'm immediately going to be cast out as a sympathizer to the right or whatever. Right. And so I don't know. I don't know what we do about any of that. Yeah.
I don't know what to do about any of that either. And it's such a mess.
Yeah.
It's not fun.
I don't want to talk to Joe Rogan, but I feel like if I had the opportunity, I would like to understand what he thinks he's doing and where he's coming and all of that stuff. I feel like I would, or whoever, if it's someone I agree with who talks to Joe Rogan, I don't think we need more shouting matches, I guess.
Right. But you know what's kind of interesting? I was thinking this earlier because I don't love or hate Joe Rogan. He got a podcast and got big with the podcast and started saying some things that were a little dumb.
Yeah.
But I went a little less neutral on Joe Rogan, but I disagree with him on this or that, but he doesn't mean harm.
Right.
And that's where I feel like we're in such a weird spot where even someone who doesn't mean harm, we can't talk to them. Mm-hmm. Because they've caused harm. Yeah.
And then we're putting up a wall, right?
Right. Yeah. We'll never get him on that. He's a liberal. He said some non-liberal things. I don't even know. Yeah. No, he's pretty
on balance, liberal guy.
Right.
Wow. It makes me think of there was some article somewhere, some point that was made maybe in the last year or so that was you remember all those people we canceled? Yeah, they're doing fine and they're all hanging out together over there and they have a huge following and they're doing great. The Louis C.K. Grammy and various other specific examples come up, but in general, I think shutting down conversations with someone because we don't agree with them, it just further isolates both sides. And
Yeah,
even
it
saying,
doesn't.
you know, if an excerpt of this conversation comes out where
People get mad
we're gonna
because it
get in
happened to
trouble,
Jon Stewart. No,
really?
people got mad at Jon Stewart when he made a point like that.
Oh, geez.
But it's right because I hated what Mel Gibson said, and I hated what Louis C.K. did, and I don't pay a lot of attention to them now because of it. And this is a larger discussion that, like we can't get into now. But the thing I notice about both of them, especially Mel Gibson, is whenever I see them, they seem like they're coming from a darker place than before their controversies.
Interesting.
Like a little light seems to be gone, a
Yeah.
little brightness, the spark seems to be gone a little bit. Even if they can do what they do, I don't mean like from a talent wise their spark. I mean their like spark of joy.
I think you're
That
right.
seems gone a little bit, and I think they should be punished for the things that they did. Totally agree with that. I don't know that the way we did it
Yeah.
made anyone else safer, anyone who could be a target for them safer. And it seems like they're just darker, and so they're not even doing better. When what we should want is for their potential, like anyone who could be harmed by them, to no longer be in danger with them in any way, and for them to be smarter, to have grown, and to be better.
Right.
I don't think we have either
No, I think you're 100% right.
because of the way we handle it.
Yes.
And that's not a great place, and it's that way because of the way we handle things.
Yeah. I'm thinking, as someone who is not a parent, I'm going to really step out of my area and say it's kind of feels like a parent who's like, oh, my kid did something bad, go live with your aunt. I realize that's the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air plot, which is a bad example. But it's sort of like, instead of learn from your mistake, it's like, go be punished and then let's never talk about it again, really.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think my thing with Louis C.K. in particular, again, not to like super go down this rabbit hole, but I was a big Louis C.K. fan. And before I started comedy, he was one of the main inspirations when I was thinking about, I would watch his sets over and over again, and I would like write down how his cadence was. And because I'm I don't know if that's, I'm a data scientist. So I was like, there's got to be a formula I can crack here. And so I would just listen to his stuff over and over and over again. We would see him live, all that stuff. And then when it happened, it was like, disappointing and all that stuff. But I was like, yeah, we all make mistakes. He, to be fair, he talked about being a disgusting, creepy dude in every set he ever did. And so it's not like we should be shocked, but okay. I loved the show and all that. I thought he seemed like a really good friend of women in the show, all that stuff. But then he really, I lost my hope about him when he came back. And I think you're so right. I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but I think you're so right that it's like, he came back without that light anymore, and it had been replaced by like a darkness and anger or resentment, and then he just kind of doubled down on his whole shtick and kept going. Whereas I feel like he had, especially given his power, especially given his fan base, he had, and his talent as a comedian, as a speaker, I think he's a smart dude, this amazing opportunity to be like, here's how like power plays out in comedy or in any world, and like men and women. He doesn't have to make it a big speech, but he could have even a 5 or 10 minute opening bit about everything that happened in a way that didn't paint him as the victim, could have gone a long way towards, like, actually, as you said, making life safer for the women he harmed, other women in comedy, other women everywhere, other people everywhere. Like he had a moment to do something, and he of all people, I think, had the skills to do it, and he didn't.
Right.
And that sucks. Yeah.
It does. And it does make it hard to then just like see him out and about. So that's why I don't pay attention to him anymore. But at the same time, is anyone safer? I don't think so. I don't see him being, I don't know. It just seems now like, because I think before, when he was like saying like, I'm a creep or whatever, it's comedy. So, he's joking, or you think, and you assume, but this is actually coming from a safe place. But then when you find out what he had done, then you realize there's not safety there. And so when he's out now and he hasn't really genuinely addressed that, then it just, that safety is gone. And so it's like, uh, I don't know what this is, but I certainly I feel
Yeah.
like maybe it's more an attack than
Yeah.
than it was before, you know? It's just
Yeah. No, it's like he had that from like never mind the safety of women and other people. I think he had an opportunity to do something just very, very cool with comedy. And
right.
you're right that he was very open and transparent about being gross. And we all thought it was sort of funny, but it was coming from a place of truth. And I think
Mhm.
great comedy can come from places of real truth. And so he could have done, and this is a whole other conversation, but like he could have gone, learned a bit from Hannah Gadsby and done something that was like actually genre expanding. And I'm going to like incur the wrath of all comedians ever. But I think that, and this goes back to your question about my show, like, I think that comedy in itself is awesome. And I think laughing is important and all of that. It makes sense of the world. I think it's a very valuable exercise, but I also think it's an incredible tool to talk about other things. And I do it in the way of data science. He could have done it in the way of like his own ideas about his own sexuality. I mean, there's obviously a lot of darkness there.
Yeah.
I don't know who am I to say what's right and wrong, but the way he did it seems wrong. I feel like there's so much that he could have unpacked. And instead, you're right. He just sort of like went back in his shell and was like, I'll just hold up a bigger sword. Right.
Yeah. It's
Like,
like
who's
a
his therapist?
bitterness.
Why aren't they doing
Yeah.
something? Yeah.
I know.
Step it up.
There's like a bitterness that these guys get, and they do it to themselves.
Yeah.
They do it to like they blame the reaction and the vitriol online
Right.
towards them, but they brought that on themselves with their
Right.
behavior.
Right.
So at some point, acknowledge that so that you can do right by the world
Yeah.
and be a healthy member of your community, and also like just clean up your own soul and your mind here and get the
Yeah.
gunk out. But they are keeping the gunk in, and it's
Yeah.
making them darker. I
Right.
feel like it's just it's sad in a humanitarian way, and it's from a comedy way, it's a huge missed opportunity, and then it's additionally sad in a humanitarian way when it comes to these women just feeling like, well,
Right.
no one's listening to us, they don't care.
Right.
That's what one of the accusers said, that well, this industry does not care,
Yeah.
and that doesn't make anyone feel safe in the industry,
No.
whether they're around him or not.
Right.
And then there's also just like the reality, because I think the way people talk, this all sort of parallels the way people talk about data to me. The way people talk online is they should just go away forever.
Yeah.
That's not really realistic. They don't go away, they dissipated, they're still walking the earth, and they still want to live the life that they want to live. So you can't really control whether or not they go away, because they
Right.
don't go away.
And it's a childish way to think about it
Mhm.
too, right? Is that like, oh, I don't like
Right.
this person, make them go away. And it kind of reminds me of I went through a long Black Mirror binge
Mm.
until the pandemic hit. And then I was like, well, no more of that. This is like too dark. But there's
Yeah.
one episode, I don't know if you're a Black Mirror person, but there's
I've
one
seen a
episode
couple. They're
where
great.
it basically is like, you can block people on social media. What if you could block them in real life? And basically like you go through a bad breakup or you disagree with someone. And so you just block them and they just become invisible in the world and you can never interact with them again. And it's like, not surprisingly, goes a bit wrong. But that is what we're
Right.
trying to do to these people. And you're right. It's like they still walk among us and are in our
Right.
community. It's like wishful thinking to be like, well, you're done. Right. As
Right.
opposed to let's have a conversation.
Right. And I understand people. I know people push back and they're like, well, why should we have a conversation with Louis C.K. and Mel Gibson? But the thing is, they're still going to be alive and in the community. So do you want
Right.
them to be better versions of themselves, or do you want them to still be these guys who haven't gone away from the wrong stuff they did?
Right.
And there's got to be some way for them to do the work so that the rest of the community can feel like safe around them, emotionally safe around them,
Right.
or just consciously safe around them,
Right. Right.
and not have that there. But even when someone does sort of apologize for more minor things than what like Louis C.K. or Mel Gibson did, people don't accept it. So it's kind of
Yeah.
like, well, where's where's going to be the desire to apologize even? So
Right.
it's all a mess.
Right.
And it just comes back to how people are choosing to use the information that they've
Yep.
gotten about someone.
Yep. And I was just going to say, there's also the piece of, as insofar as we have control over this, which is, we can argue, maybe more limited than we realize, but what information do I release about myself to the world? Right. And I know that I am more circumspect in my posts about my own opinions and things like that, in part because I fear backlash and I fear fights that go nowhere, or I think, or maybe on the plus side, I have some humility and it's like, we don't need to just hear my hot take on this thing. How about that? Right.
Right.
But what do we do with the information we have about somebody? We definitely don't have all the information about Louis C.K., right? We have some data that's been unearthed and that we've all told our stories about, but he also, presumably would have preferred that information not get out. And so if he could control his own data narrative, the story might be different as well.
Right. And if it happened probably 10 years prior,
yeah,
the information wouldn't have come out.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the circus performing and the comedy. I assume with circus performing, that came from you maybe being in gymnastics or a ballerina when you were a kid. And then it eventually turned into doing circus work. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. I didn't start dance until I was in 9th grade, so like 14, which is insanely late to start dance.
Yeah, that is.
And I regret that to this day, I think, because I actually, once I got into it, I was like, I love this. Oh my God, but I don't have the feet. I don't have the legs. I don't have the anything for it. And so I spent a lot of my college and early grad school years being like, okay, those days are behind me. Dance was fun. And I did ballet and jazz and all that stuff. And so I got to move on and be an adult. And in grad school, I was going through just a mental breakdown after, like, they break you down in grad. You're like, I'm the dumbest person who ever lived. I need to, hide in a hole and never come out. And I was kind of keeping myself sane through a mix of like yoga. I did figure skating. I did synchronized swimming at University of Michigan for 2 years. And then they were like, you are too old for our undergraduate team. Like, stop it. And I eventually found circus at this warehouse in Detroit and was like, well, this is it. This is the thing. And so you're exactly right. It's a great place to go if you grew up doing any kind of like dance gymnastics, but we're not good enough to do the Olympics or New York City Ballet, but still want to be, at least for me, it was a good fit in terms of just still being physically active and using your body and movement and all that kind of stuff. And it's a very nice break, as anyone who knows, who's into, running or climbing, whatever it is that you do, it's nice to get out of your head. And that's what circus does for me. And so that's been pretty much my, keeps me sane. And I kind of go nuts if I don't do it for a while, which is weird to say because normally people go nuts and then run away to the circus. Well, I guess that is what happens, but yeah. Yeah. Are you a acrobatic person at all? Gymnastics, anything like that?
No, I one time in 6th grade, I was standing in line and just goofing around, did something with my feet. And a teacher walked up and said, that's 5th position. That's really hard to do. And I was like, huh? I don't know. I was just goofing around.
Ooh. Yeah. Well done.
So I'm pretty limber. So
Okay.
I guess I could have, but I've
Nice.
never taken a dance class beyond swing class, and that's just
Yeah.
that's just fun out with friends. That's
Right.
there's nothing official about that.
Right. Man, I'm so jealous. My 5th position, I still do ballet just kind of for fun. And my 5th position needs some work, man. Well done. I'm very jealous.
I tried it the other day and I was like, oh, I still got it. It's not quite as limber as 11-year-old me, but it's there. It's there.
Well done. Yeah, well done. Well, and I see that with people who have like beautiful toe points and things, because it's your bones are either formed in a way that lend themselves to pointing or they don't. And one thing that can really help is doing ballet from the moment you can walk, right? And then kind of molding your foot in that form. But some people are just born like that, and I'm just very jealous. So it's the jealousy, I would say, that keeps me motivated.
And did comedy come after grad school, or is that something you had started sooner?
I was into like theater and stuff. So around when I started doing dance, I was also doing musical theater and acting and performing. So I always had like a performy side of me. And then again in grad school, when I was breaking down, I got very into improv, and I went to grad school in Michigan, and then I would come to New York for the summers and take the UCB classes and like do that whole thing. And the main reason I did improv was that I really wanted to do comedy, and I had become obsessed. This sounds very boring, but in high school, I listened to, I'd never really heard stand up. And then I heard Jerry Seinfeld's I'm Telling You for the Last time. And my brain was just like, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened to humans in the whole world. And I know it sounds so, it's like being like, I like the Beatles, which I also do, right? So I'm very boring in terms of my, mainstream.
It's fair. There's a reason those guys are the biggest.
Yeah, they're legends.
They're good.
Yeah,
you could like
they know what they're doing. Yeah. I don't know if anyone knows this, but like Jerry Seinfeld knows what he's doing with comedy. But I was just immediately taken with it, and I was like, this just seems like the best thing ever. And I would play it and like speak along with it, and again memorize the cadence and all that kind of stuff. But I was way too afraid to do it. So I did improv instead, where I was like, you're up there with a bunch of other people. You're kind of being silly. Everyone knows you haven't planned anything. So if it's not funny, it's like, well, you didn't plan. Of course it's not gonna be funny, right? And so I was just sort of like, it was safer, but I was not good at it. And it took until I was at NYU Shanghai, teaching political science out there and doing some improv. There was a local improv community, mix of expat and locals. And so we did some like bilingual stuff. I mostly did English, but there was some bilingual stuff, which was cool. Anyway, they had a stand-up scene, and one night I finally was like, all right, I'm doing it. And if it goes horribly, I'll just leave the continent forever and never come back. So it took being in China and knowing I could just like abruptly end my entire life to get up the courage to do stand-up. And then as one does, I sucked for a really long time. And I even quit for a year because I was so bad at it. But then I was just, again, irritated that I had given it up. So I went back, and now I do that.
Well, this has been a really awesome chat. We are now at the end of the episode.
Right.
And we got to create something together. I'm trying to decide what it could be. Maybe it's another data science show or another show that could attack a subject. Not attack, that's the wrong word. But could tackle a subject the way data science was tackled in your show. Or maybe it's just how to make a show about something like data science that maybe is not the first topic on everyone's mind. It's not the front of brain topic for everyone. Right. So how do you find ways to make that interesting and fun for people? Which of those would you like to try to do?
Right. I like that last one. I like the idea of making something, either something obscure or that people think is not important or not interesting, make it something that people want to pay attention to in some way.
Okay. So what is the first thing? Obviously, for you, this was a subject that meant a lot to you. You're very passionate about it because of the way you were seeing it talked about publicly. So there's that impetus. Maybe that's a good start for somebody. Like, what is a thing that you were tired of people getting wrong?
Right. Yeah. What are you mad about? Start there.
Right. And then if it's something that is either maybe the average person would be bored by, or if it's something that you would really have to get the language right just to change the way people perceive it. Because that was the other wrinkle in your show, is that everyone was wrong about the way they talk about data. So you were kind of flipping things for people. You're flipping perspectives for people. So once you have a subject, how do you then say, okay, what's funny or what would be exciting? Like, what's your next step?
My actual next step in all this, as you were saying it, I was like, oh, what should I talk about next? And the two that come to mind are, one is a field called complexity, which is actually the map I have behind me is the logistic map, which is a model of deterministic chaos. And it shows that you can have chaos inside a completely closed system and still not be able to predict the outcome. So it's a reminder that we don't know what the heck's going on. And it's a field that nobody is talking about. So at least data science, I had the advantage of a buzzword, which is like people are hearing about it. So they're kind of like, oh yeah, what is that? Even if they're not thinking about it and it's not top of mind. Complexity is a field that nobody is talking about, but that I think is awesome. And so I would love to be able to do my data science show, but for the field of complexity. And then the other one is a little bit more self-serving and maybe too political for anyone's appetite, but I think Something around gender, transgender stuff is also another topic that it is more top of mind for people, but I think we're talking about it in a million different ways that are not that productive either. So,
Oh gosh, yeah, that's very true.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
and that would have, there's the element of it's something you're passionate about. It has the element of having to change the way people think about it, but then
right,
it's also a very sensitive subject.
right, right,
So that is another thing to consider when it comes to
right.
how you present it.
Right. And at least data science is not, I mean, it can be, and it is used in topics that are very, very sensitive and personal to people, but the field itself is not really known for being like related to one's identity. Right. And so I think that's a good point, that it's one thing to be sort of flippant and make jokes about data science. And I think doing that about gender is very, very tricky, as,
Right.
as Dave Chappelle teaches us.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Among
for sure.
others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. But and then complexity, the problem is no one knows what it is. So you kind of have to sell the topic and then what it is. And I ran into that before the Data Science Spectacular, before the pandemic. I did a number of shows at Caveat about political science. And I would talk about the various types of research behind, like, why do we vote? How do we get more people to vote? What are the most, ethical and fair and just voting systems in the world, and all this stuff that I think is super interesting. But because it's something that's personally meaningful to a lot of people, people would come in expecting like either to hear like, preaching to the choir in terms of the home team, or, kind of policy wonk sort of stuff. And so I had a kind of a branding problem. So in a way, data science, again, was a little bit easier because people have heard of it, but they don't really have a strong idea about what it is. Whereas when I said, oh, I do political science, people usually wanted to come on and talk about like the latest congressional race or abortion policy. And it's like, we can talk about those things, but that's not what political science is typically thinking about.
Oh, very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is something you have to contend with when you're talking about something that is a hotbed topic or is just something people misunderstand, is that you can't just go in and speak. I guess this is sort of like what we were talking about before about the way the layperson sees something, because you can't just go in and speak about it the way an expert understands it. You also have to think, well, first I have to explain to them that they've been defining it incorrectly this whole time.
Right.
And then using that definition incorrectly.
Yeah, was sort of like, if anything, the easiest topic I could have done of the ones that I'm interested in, because it was like people know about it, but no one is yet, I don't think, particularly wedded to a view of what it is. And it's sort of new enough and popular enough that I can sort of swoop in and be like, these are the sorts of things you've heard. Here's what you should say instead. Whereas with political science, one of the issues I ran into quite a bit was I would say things like, this is a nonpartisan show, in the sense that I wasn't there to promote the agenda of a particular party. But people would read that as like dismissive of how politics affects their lives. And that's not what I mean. I don't mean to say that politics don't affect you and that we can separate politics from ourselves. It was more like, I'm not here to raise money for the Democratic Party. But even that, because it's so, they're like, all politics is personal. What do you mean you're nonpartisan? You're like, oh God, I'm just doing math. But maybe that's the point. I don't know.
That's very interesting. Yeah, because the goings on in DC, we aren't really as privy to, like how they really talk to each other, how senators really deal with the president and with each other, and try to get the language of things right. What they all are doing overall is going to affect us, but their day to day is so separate from what we see.
Yeah. And I think it's mostly very boring. I could be wrong. I think it's very dull. Having looked at some data from Congress, it's not that exciting. At least what we've chosen to measure is not exciting. Maybe the interesting stuff is almost certainly not ending up in the data sets I've seen. So maybe that's
anyone who's seen C-SPAN knows that to be true.
Yeah. The big revolution in political science, and my entryway into data science methods was natural language processing. So turning text into data. And I am sure that basically it was like, oh, political scientists no longer have to listen to C-SPAN. We just take the transcript and churn it through a computer. And that's like such a relief for the field. It's just way better. You don't have to like read speeches or anything anymore. It's like, okay, perfect. The machines can do it.
So when you're putting together a show and you want it to be fun and funny, do you kind of write your thesis or write your dissertation, so to speak, and then find ways to put in humor and fun stuff?
Exactly. Yeah. I almost always, and sometimes I'll get in my own way and I'll try to do it backwards and it never works. But I will normally say, okay, I need to write it. I have an idea of what the interesting thing is. So in the case of the Data Science Spectacular, I actually had, I think, too many ideas and I should have started with fewer, but generally is like, we have the wrong idea about what data is. Okay. And then I have to write from beginning to end. If I start to outline and go in, it gets dry and weird. So I just have to say like, okay, how would I start talking about this? Well, okay, what would I say? Like the way George R.R. Martin talks about writing stories, not to really flatter myself, right? And then as I go, I basically try to write in what I think is funny. And sometimes it'll be like, well, what if the example we used was funny? What if we talked about this in the context of a party? Like I have a few go-tos that I tend to do. So yeah, so it's very like narrative style, I would say.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
And what is the final stage? Is honing it the last stage, or is there something that you even have to do after that for your kind of show?
Well, that's a good question. I am currently trying to figure out what to do with that show. And the one you saw was the first time I'd ever performed it. And I would like to make it way better and tighter and adjust all these things, and ideally tour a version of it or submit it for a festival or something like that.
Right. Or record it and make it like a nice film.
That's true. That's a good idea.
That could be cool.
Yeah. Maybe I'll do that and save myself a lot of grief booking theaters. But as far as honing it, I mean, great art, right, is never finished. It's only abandoned. I was writing slides up until the house opened for that show.
Oh, wow.
So it was like there were sections that I had done before and the circus pieces were choreographed and I had all the animations were in, but there was like a whole, I don't know if you go back and watch the recording, which I don't recommend, but you're welcome to. The ending, there's a slide where I'm just like, what's my point? And I just have like words because I like couldn't figure out how to get it into like a thing. And so I was just like, well, the house is open. Here we go. Like it's one of those where it's like, I'll keep fussing with it until it's time to go. And that's just how I am with anything. I'll turn something in the second it's due, or like if I speak at a company, they'll often say like a few days ahead, they're like, can you send in your slides? And I'm like, I can, but I'm going to fuss with these for 4 more days, no matter what. So you don't want me to send them in. So it's maybe that counts as honing. I don't know. But I literally was like writing and starting at the same time.
That's a really interesting thing because that's like a live show, where it can change up until the very end. Yeah, that is certainly stressful, but it's very interesting that that's part of your process.
Yeah. No, and then to quote a grad school professor of mine, how did he put it? He said, fear focuses the mind. And there's nothing more terrifying than going on stage in front of like everybody that you know to talk about the field that you supposedly study and have promised to make fun. And so it just like, you write as much as you can and you prepare as much as you can. And then in the moment, you hope that like the stars align and you're able to like also perform it well. Right. And the fear really helps, but, the adrenaline and all that kind of stuff. But I don't know. I'm bad at taking that and then building from it. Like my instinct is to throw it all away and start again. Like I'm very good at like the first draft, put it out there. All right, that was okay. I can make it better, but I'll just do something new instead. So I need to challenge myself to do kind of what you suggested, which is build on what I have here or put it into a movie version or another format or something. Because literally I was like, cool, I did it. I'll never talk about data science again, but that's not useful. Like now I've said it. I've said my piece. I'm going to move on. Well, that's not good.
There it is. Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Of course. Thanks for having me. I feel like we finally solved all the issues with, comedy, polarization, meaning of life, everything else.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah. That's what I came here for. But yeah, thanks a lot. This was really fun.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for listening. And follow Andrea on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Jones-Rooy. There are 2 O's in that Roy. Also, check out their podcast, Majoring in Everything, wherever you get podcasts, and on YouTube, youtube.com/JonesRooy. And there's more info on their website, jonesrooy.com. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at There It Is Pod, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at There It Is, and follow me on Twitter at JasonFarJokes and Instagram at JasonFarPics. Go to thereitispod.com for newsletter and support info, links in bio. Great episode next week. Until next time, be good to each other.
The music for the theme song was created by Neil Brooks. The rap was written and performed by Nick Acevedo. The logo for There It Is was created by Jeff Prater. The There It Is podcast is produced by Jason Farr.